When two cops corner a black teenager in a quiet suburb, a routine stop turns into a terrifying standoff. They shout, reach for their guns, until a black SUV screeches in. The woman who steps out flashes her badge, her voice cold as steel. FBI, step away from my son. Before we begin, hit subscribe to Black Battles, where every story hits harder than truth itself. The sun was setting over suburban Maryland, painting the quiet neighborhood in soft orange light. 16-year-old Evan Parker walked down the narrow street, his school bag hanging loosely from one shoulder. His hoodie was up, not because he was hiding. It was just cold, the kind of evening chill that made his breath visible in the air. He had just left basketball practice, earbuds in, listening to a song his best friend had sent him earlier that day. It was supposed to be an ordinary walk home, but fate had decided otherwise. A white police cruiser turned the corner slowly, its engine humming softly. Inside sat Officer Brian Keller, a 6-year veteran of the force, and Lieutenant Greg Howard, his older, more cautious partner. Their shift had been dull. No action, no calls, just radio chatter about some suspicious individual walking through the neighborhood. The report was vague, but it used the same words that always made Brian's pulse rise. Black male. Hoodie, backpack. Could be him, Brian muttered, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. Greg glanced up from his tablet. It's probably just a kid heading home. Brian didn't reply. He slowed the cruiser until it crawled beside Evan. The boy didn't notice at first. He was nodding his head slightly to the music. The red and blue light suddenly flashed, reflecting off the street signs and Evan's backpack zipper. Evan froze. He pulled out one earbud, uncertain. Hey, you, Brian called out, stepping out of the car. Stop right there, Evan turned, confused. Me? Yeah, you, Brian said, walking closer. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Evan blinked. I live here. But his answer only seemed to make Brian more suspicious. The officer's hand rested casually near his holster, and his tone carried that subtle weight, the one that said you're already guilty. Greg sighed quietly and got out of the car too, though he hung back, watching the situation unfold. A few neighbors peeked from their porches. One man pretended to water his lawn, phone in hand, recording. Evan could feel every pair of eyes on him. His heart began to pound. I just got off basketball practice, he said softly. I'm going home. My house is on the next street, Brian circled him slowly. Mind showing me some ID? Evan frowned, confused. I'm 16. Don't have one on me. That was the wrong answer. Brian reached for Evan's backpack. Then I'll take a look in here. Evan instinctively pulled it back. Sir, that's my— Don't move! Brian snapped, grabbing the strap. Greg stepped forward quickly. Brian, easy. He's just a kid. But Brian was already unzipping the bag, ignoring Greg's tone. He found nothing but school books, a half-empty water bottle, and a broken pencil. He exhaled, disappointed. Not because of what he'd found, but because of what he hadn't. Evan's hands were trembling now. Can I call my mom? Brian gave a short, mocking laugh. Sure, go ahead. See what Mommy says. The crowd around them was growing. Someone whispered. He didn't even do anything. Another voice said, This happens every week. Evan felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt before. The police lights painted his face in flashes of red and blue, colors of authority that now looked like colors of danger. His throat tightened as he dialed a number. Mom, he said when she picked up. His voice cracked. Can you come now? There was silence on the other end, then a calm, firm voice, the kind that carried both authority and love. Evan, where are you? He told her. Stay where you are, she said. I'm on my way. When he hung up, he could feel every second stretch longer than the last. Brian kept pacing, glancing at Greg as if to justify his suspicion. Greg's jaw was tight now. Even he could see this had gone too far, but it was too late. The situation had already drawn a crowd, and the flashing lights had become a spectacle. Evan stood still, gripping his backpack strap with both hands, unaware that within minutes, the street would witness something it would never forget, because his mother, Special Agent Rebecca Parker of the FBI, was already on her way. And when she arrived, no badge in that neighborhood would shine brighter than hers. The street had grown uncomfortably quiet, except for the pulsing hum of the police cruiser's lights. Evan stood near the curb, his backpack now hanging open beside his feet, pages from his notebook fluttering in the light breeze. The neighbors watched in silence, uncertain whether to speak or stay out of it. Officer Brian Keller adjusted his belt and folded his arms, towering over the 16-year-old boy. "So," he said, "you say you live here. Which house?" Evan pointed down the block. "Number 412. The white one with the blue mailbox," Brian smirked. "That's convenient. You got any proof of that?" Evan hesitated. "He didn't carry mail or bills in his school bag." "I told you, sir. I live there with my mom." "You can ask her when she gets here." Brian's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." He motioned to Greg. "Run a check on his name." Greg sighed, opening his tablet. "What's your full name, son?" "Evan Parker," he said quietly. Greg typed it in. The system lagged for a moment before displaying no record found. "Nothing," Greg said. "He's clean." But Brian wasn't satisfied. "Clean doesn't mean innocent," he muttered. "What were you really doing walking here after dark?" Evan's voice shook. "I was walking home from practice." "My coach, don't get smart with me," Brian barked, cutting him off. Evan flinched. The crowd murmured. Someone from across the street yelled, "He's a kid, man." Brian ignored it. Greg shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "Brian, let's just cool it until his mom gets here. We can confirm everything then." But Brian didn't want to wait. He'd already made up his mind, and his ego was louder than his reason. He leaned closer to Evan. "You got anything in your pockets I should know about? Anything illegal?" Evan shook his head rapidly. "No, sir," Brian gestured. "Then turn out your pockets." The boy hesitated. His hands trembled as he reached into his hoodie, pulling out a crumpled receipt, a keychain, and his phone. He held them out, hoping it would be enough. Brian looked them over and then, in a move that made the crowd gasp, dropped them on the ground. "Pick it up," he ordered coldly. Evan stared at the items lying near his shoes. The phone his mom had saved up for, the keychain his sister had made him. His throat burned. "Sir, please," he said softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Brian's voice dropped lower, almost threatening. "You can stop talking when I tell you to." Greg stepped forward now, unable to stay quiet. "Brian, enough. This is turning bad." "Then go sit in the car," Brian snapped. "I've got this." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the trees. Even the bystanders stopped talking, watching the scene unfold like a movie they wished they could pause. Evan blinked back tears he didn't want anyone to see. He looked down at his phone, the call timer still running. His mom hadn't hung up. She'd heard everything. A car engine roared in the distance. Greg turned his head at the sound. It was a black SUV speeding toward them, headlights slicing through the dusk. The crowd stepped back instinctively. The SUV came to a sharp stop beside the police cruiser, and the door swung open. Out stepped Rebecca Parker, tall and composed, her dark trench coat moving slightly in the wind. Her badge glimmered faintly against the light of the cruiser. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply walked toward the officers with a calm, deliberate pace and the kind that carried authority in every step. "Evan," she said quietly. Without breaking her gaze from the officers, "Come here." Her son obeyed instantly, relief flooding his face as he moved behind her. Brian blinked, confused. "Ma'am, this is a restricted scene. You can't just—" Rebecca cut him off with a voice that was steady as steel. "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Parker, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And you've made a serious mistake." The street fell utterly silent. Greg's mouth parted slightly. "FBI?" Rebecca reached into her coat, pulled out her badge, and held it up. The gold shimmered under the flashing lights. "Yes," she said calmly. "Now let's talk about why 2 officers detained a minor without probable cause." Brian's face lost its color. The crowd began whispering again, louder this time. Someone muttered, "She's FBI." "Oh man, they're in trouble." Evan stood behind his mother, feeling for the first time in 20 minutes that he could breathe again. And as Rebecca stared both men down, it became clear the power in this street had just shifted. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, like the entire block was holding its breath. The red and blue lights flickered against the windows, painting everything in sharp flashes of authority and shame. Officer Brian Keller's confidence cracked. His hand, which moments ago rested near his holster, now hovered awkwardly at his side. Greg Howard stood a few steps back, his eyes wide, torn between professionalism and disbelief. Rebecca Parker took one slow step forward. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and commanding, the kind of tone that could quiet an entire courtroom. "I asked a question, officers," she said. "Why did you stop my son?" Brian swallowed. "Ma'am, there was a report about a suspicious what?" she interrupted. "A black teenager walking home with a backpack?" The words landed hard. The crowd murmured again. Someone nearby whispered, "She's right." Rebecca's eyes never left Brian's face. She could see his discomfort, his pride struggling to mask the truth. "You searched his bag," she continued, "without consent or probable cause. You made physical contact, raised your voice, and surrounded a minor. Is that your idea of community protection?" Brian took a step back, suddenly aware of the cameras pointed at him from every angle. Phones were up. People were recording. Even Greg's expression showed regret. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job," Brian stammered. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "Your job," she repeated, her voice calm but cutting. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to intimidate and assume." Evan stood behind her, his heart still pounding. He watched his mother with wide eyes, the same woman who helped him with homework, who laughed too loud at sitcoms, who now looked like she could command an army. For the first time he saw what strength really looked like, quiet, unshaken, and absolute. Greg finally spoke, his voice low. "Agent Parker, I'm sorry, I should have stepped in sooner." Rebecca looked at him. "You're right, you should have." The apology didn't erase the moment, but it mattered. It was the first hint of accountability, something this neighborhood rarely saw from uniforms. The crowd grew bolder now. A woman holding a phone said loudly, "You tell him, ma'am." Another man nodded, crossing his arms. "About time someone called them out." Brian's breathing grew heavier. The longer Rebecca spoke, the smaller he seemed. Every word peeled back another layer of the image he'd built for himself. The enforcer, the authority figure, the man in control. Now, in front of the people he was supposed to protect, he was being held accountable. Rebecca stepped closer until she stood directly in front of him. Her FBI badge glinted in the flashing lights. "You know," she said quietly, "I train agents who deal with criminals twice your size, and they still manage to do it with respect. What you did here wasn't policing, it was profiling. And it ends tonight." Brian's mouth opened as if to argue, but the words never came. His radio crackled on his shoulder, a dispatch voice asking for a check-in. He didn't answer. Evan's phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from one of his classmates. "Dredd, dude, you're trending. The video's already online." He looked up. People were still recording, dozens of eyes on him and his mother. But this time, he didn't feel ashamed. He felt protected. Rebecca turned to her son. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, Mom. Just ready to go home." She nodded once, then looked back at the officers. "We're done here." Without waiting for permission, she took Evan's arm and began walking him toward their SUV. The crowd stepped aside, silent but respectful, like witnesses to something sacred. Behind them, Greg placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "Man," he said quietly, "you just profiled an FBI agent's kid. That's going to follow you." Brian didn't reply. His chest was tight with something he couldn't quite name. Guilt, fear, humiliation. As Rebecca opened the car door for Evan, the flashing lights reflected in her eyes. For years, she'd worked to fix what was broken in the system. Tonight, that system had come to her doorstep. She looked back once more, not with anger, but with a kind of calm warning. "Next time," she said to no one in particular, "remember this face before you assume." Then she got into the SUV, and the door closed with a soft, final click. The lights of the police cruiser still flashed, but somehow, the color red didn't look like authority anymore. It looked like guilt. The drive home was silent. Outside the SUV, the neighborhood lights blurred past. Street lamps, houses, and the faint shimmer of the police lights fading behind them. Inside, neither Rebecca nor Evan spoke for several minutes. The only sound was the rhythmic turn of the tires against the asphalt and the faint hum of the engine. Evan sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, replaying everything that had happened. The officer's voice, the cold command, the sound of his backpack hitting the ground. It all looped in his head like a scene that wouldn't stop. Rebecca kept her eyes on the road, hands steady on the steering wheel, her jaw tight. Outwardly, she was calm. Years of training had taught her control. But inside, she was seething. Not just as a mother, as an agent, as a black woman who'd seen too many versions of this same story. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Rebecca turned off the engine but didn't move. She took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch. Evan finally spoke, his voice low. "Mom." He hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" Rebecca turned her head, her expression softening instantly. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong." He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't move from the window. They looked at me like I didn't belong there. Rebecca's heart broke a little at that. She reached over, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You do belong there. You belong anywhere your feet take you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." He nodded again, but she could see it. That quiet confusion and pain teenagers often hide behind silence. Rebecca stepped out of the car first. The air was colder now, the night deep and still. Evan followed, backpack slung low on his shoulder, the zipper still half open from the search. When they got inside, Rebecca walked straight to her office, a small room tucked near the kitchen, lined with FBI case files and framed commendations. She closed the door and sat down at her desk. For a long moment, she just stared at her badge. The gold surface reflected the faint lamplight. It was supposed to mean something. Protection, justice, trust. Tonight, it felt heavier than ever. She opened her laptop and began typing an incident report. Not as a mother seeking revenge, but as a federal agent demanding accountability. Time, 6:48 p.m. Location, Maplewood Avenue. Subject, unlawful detainment and profiling of minor. Her fingers moved steadily, each word deliberate. She listed the officers' names, badge numbers, details of the confrontation, the unlawful search, and the crowd of witnesses. Halfway through, her phone buzzed, a text from one of her colleagues at the bureau. "Tanya, FBI. Saw the video already. It's all over social media. You okay?" Rebecca. "We're fine, but this won't go unaddressed." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. She didn't want fame, didn't want headlines. What she wanted was change, the kind that sticks. Meanwhile, Evan sat on the couch in the living room, scrolling through his phone. The video had indeed gone viral. Thousands of comments were flooding in, some supportive, some angry, some disbelieving. "This is why people record everything. That mom's a legend. Imagine being that cop right now," he scrolled. Further, then stopped when he saw one comment that simply said, "That could have been me." And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just about him and his mom. It was about every kid who'd ever been seen as a threat before being seen as a person. Rebecca came out of her office quietly and found him sitting there, phone in hand, face dimly lit by the screen's glow. She sat beside him. "You know," she said softly, "I've spent my whole career fighting for justice in rooms full of rules and paperwork. But tonight," she paused, searching for the right words. "Tonight it was personal." Evan looked up at her, eyes tired but steady. "What happens now?" Rebecca gave a small, determined smile. "Now we make sure this never happens again. To anyone." The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, the world buzzed with the story of what had happened on Maplewood Avenue. But inside that small house, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something bigger begins. By morning, the world had already found out what happened on Maplewood Avenue. The video, shaky, recorded from a neighbor's porch, had spread across every major social media platform. Millions had seen it by sunrise. The title that topped every feed read, FBI agent confronts police for racially profiling her son. Within hours, hashtags started trending. Evan Parker, justice in plainclothes. Do better. News vans began parking at the edge of the neighborhood. Reporters stood outside rehearsing their intros. Cameras pointed toward the quiet house with the blue mailbox. Inside, Rebecca Parker sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, coffee untouched. She wasn't scrolling through the comments or watching the interviews. She was drafting a formal complaint to the Department of Justice. Her tone was precise, professional. Every sentence grounded in facts. The emotion would come later. Right now, she was building a case. Evan sat across from her, phone buzzing with notifications every few seconds. He'd become the center of a story he never asked to be in. Some people called him brave. Others called him lucky. But to him, it didn't feel like either, and it felt heavy, like his whole life had changed overnight. "Mom," he said softly, setting his phone down. "People are asking for interviews. News channels, even a podcast." Rebecca looked up, her expression calm but firm. "You don't owe anyone your story, Evan, not until you're ready." He nodded, grateful. But curiosity tugged at him. "Are those cops going to get in trouble?" Rebecca leaned back in her chair. "There's an internal review happening. The Bureau's watching, and now the world is too." She didn't add what she was really thinking, that these cases rarely ended cleanly. That accountability was often buried under excuses and procedure. But she wasn't just a witness this time. She was part of the story, and she had no intention of letting it fade into silence. At the local Maplewood Police Department, chaos was brewing. Lieutenant Greg Howard sat at his desk, staring at the news clip playing on his computer screen. The camera had caught everything. The search, the shouting, the moment Rebecca flashed her badge. He knew it didn't look good. Captain Stevens stormed through the hallway, barking orders. Keller's suspended until further notice. "I want statements from everyone involved." Brian Keller sat in a small conference room, head in his hands. His badge lay on the table in front of him. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered. Greg looked at him, disappointment in his eyes. "That's the problem, Brian. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them right." The department's phone lines were blowing up. Journalists, civil rights groups, even politicians asking for comment. What had started as one bad stop had become a national headline. Meanwhile, at the FBI field office, Rebecca's name was whispered in every corridor. Some called her bold, others called her reckless, but most agreed on one thing. She'd forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored. That afternoon, she received a call from Deputy Director Hayes. His tone was respectful but heavy. "Rebecca, the Bureau stands with you," he said. "We're coordinating with DOJ oversight. Just be prepared for attention. Not all of it will be kind." "I understand," she replied. "But I'm not doing this for attention. I'm doing it because I'm tired of silence being mistaken for peace." That night, Evan scrolled through messages again. This time something new appeared. A letter from a mother in Chicago. "My son went through the same thing. Watching your video gave me hope." He showed it to Rebecca. She read it quietly, then smiled faintly. "See? Change doesn't start big, Evan. It starts one person at a time." Outside, the media lights still flashed from down the street, but inside their house, the noise faded into a kind of calm resolve. Rebecca closed her laptop, finally sipping her cold coffee. "Mom?" Evan asked after a moment. "Are you scared?" She thought for a second, then shook her head. "No, I've seen worse than fear. What I feel right now," she paused, glancing out the window, "is purpose." The house fell quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence before movement, before change. And in that stillness, under the hum of distant news vans, Rebecca Parker knew this story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The following week felt longer than any in recent memory. For Rebecca Parker, the days blurred into a steady rhythm of meetings, interviews, and phone calls. Every agency wanted a statement. The FBI, the DOJ, the local police department's oversight board. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted control of the story. But for Rebecca, it wasn't about control. It was about truth. Each morning she woke up before sunrise, sat in her office with a cup of coffee, and reread the same 3 pages. her official statement, her son's account, and the transcript of the 911 report that started it all. Suspicious male walking through neighborhood. That single line still made her chest tighten. How many times had that same phrase been used to justify something far worse? At school, Evan tried to keep things normal, but it wasn't easy. His friends treated him differently now, half curious, half cautious. Some whispered when he walked by. Others slapped him on the shoulder, saying things like, "You're famous, man," not realizing that fame wasn't what he'd earned. During lunch, his best friend Malik sat across from him. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Evan shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. I just wish people would stop staring at me." Malik nodded. "They're not staring at you, bro. They're staring at what happened to you." That night, Evan came home quieter than usual. He found his mother in the kitchen, sorting through files. "They called me into the principal's office today," he said. Rebecca looked up, alert. "Why? Did something happen?" "No," Evan said quickly. "They just wanted to make sure I was okay. The counselor said if I need someone to talk to, she's there." Rebecca smiled gently. "That's good. Talking helps." He leaned on the counter. "Do you ever get tired of talking about it?" Her eyes softened. "Every day. But silence lets the wrong people write the story." Evan nodded, thoughtful. He didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but he could feel its truth. Meanwhile, the investigation moved forward, and the media circus grew louder. Protesters began gathering outside the Maplewood Police Department, holding signs that read, "Enough profiling" and "Accountability for all." News anchors debated whether the officer's suspension was enough. Social media argued endlessly, and through it all, Rebecca kept her composure. No interviews, no speeches, just steady professional presence. But behind that calm was exhaustion. Late one evening, she sat alone on the porch, staring at the quiet street. The same street where it had all started. Every porch light looked too bright now. Every siren in the distance too close. Evan stepped outside, joining her with a blanket draped over his shoulders. "You should come in, Mom. It's cold." "I know," she said softly, still watching the road. "I just keep thinking, what if I hadn't picked up that call in time?" He followed her gaze, understanding now what she didn't say, the fear that lived beneath her strength. "But you did pick up," he reminded her. "You showed up?" Rebecca smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Yeah, I showed up." She turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "Promise me something, Evan. Don't let this make you bitter. Let it make you aware but not angry." "There's a difference," he nodded slowly. "I'll try." The next morning, the Department of Justice issued a formal statement. An investigation is underway into the unlawful detention of a minor, Evan Parker, by members of the Maplewood Police Department. The Bureau fully supports transparency and accountability in this matter. The statement went viral within minutes. For some, it was justice in motion. For others, just another headline. But for Rebecca, it was a start. That evening, as the sun set over their quiet neighborhood, she looked out from her porch again, this time without fear. Evan joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Feels different out here," he said. "It should," she replied. "You stood your ground, and now the world knows your name for the right reasons." He smiled, a small, tired smile, but a real one. And as the last light of day disappeared, mother and son sat side by side, silent but strong, a reminder that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins with a whisper and a woman who refuses to look away. 3 months later, Maplewood felt different. The leaves had changed color, the air had grown cooler, and yet, beneath the calm, something in the town's rhythm had shifted. Conversations were quieter, more cautious. Police cruisers drove slower through residential streets. And for the first time in years, people actually looked one another in the eye. The incident that began with flashing red and blue lights was no longer just a local scandal. It had become a national conversation. News outlets called it the Maplewood mistake. Others labeled it the turning point. Whatever the name, its impact was undeniable. Inside the Department of Justice, the case file lay open across a long oak table. The findings were clear. The officers had violated protocol. Their use of force was unjustified. Their assumptions had been driven not by threat, but by bias. When the verdict was read aloud in the federal courtroom, Rebecca Parker sat in the back row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evan sat beside her, wearing his best suit, the same one he'd worn to his grandmother's funeral years before. Sergeant Cole Evans and Officer Danny Ruiz, the judge's voice echoed, are hereby found guilty of misconduct, unlawful detention, and falsification of incident reports. They are sentenced to 6 months in federal custody and permanently dismissed from law enforcement service. A hush fell over the courtroom. For a moment, Rebecca didn't breathe. She looked at Evan, his face calm, his eyes steady, and felt the weight she'd carried for months begin to lift. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Agent Parker, do you have a comment on the verdict? Do you feel justice was served? Will you continue to work with local police departments after this? Rebecca paused at the top of the stairs, her son beside her. She didn't smile. She didn't posture. She simply said justice is never about revenge. It's about correction and prevention. My son deserves both. Her words echoed across television screens that night. Clips of her calm expression and measured tone went viral, shared under captions like the definition of grace and strength without anger. But behind closed doors, away from the spotlight, Rebecca allowed herself to finally exhale. That night, she sat at Evan's desk in his room, his textbooks stacked neatly, his guitar propped against the wall. On the bulletin board above the desk hung a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Mother Saves Son, from Racially Charged Police Stop." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You're not just a headline, baby," she whispered. "You're a beginning." A few days later, the FBI invited Rebecca to lead a new training initiative, one focused on community policing, racial awareness, and ethical response. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a mission, and she accepted it without hesitation. Meanwhile, Evan began speaking at local schools about what happened, not as a victim, but as a voice. He told his story simply, never with bitterness. "The truth," he said, standing in front of students his age, "is that fear grows where understanding is missing. We can fix that if we stop assuming and start listening." The auditorium always went silent after those words. One evening, after another one of Evan's talks, he and his mother drove home in quiet contentment. The city lights shimmered against the windshield, the hum of traffic soft and calm. Evan looked over at her. "Do you ever think about that night?" Rebecca's hands tightened briefly on the steering wheel. "Every now and then. But I try not to live there," he nodded. "Me too." They stopped at a red light. Outside, a police cruiser passed in the opposite lane. This time, Rebecca didn't tense. Evan didn't look away. Both just watched, then turned forward as the light turned green. For the first time, the road ahead didn't feel dangerous. It felt open. Weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning, they visited the park where it had all started. The grass was wet with dew, the air filled with children's laughter. Evan took a deep breath. "You know," he said, "I used to hate this place. Now it kind of feels like peace." Rebecca smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "Peace isn't where the story starts, Evan. It's where it continues." They walked together down the path, the sound of sirens faint in the distance. Not a warning this time, but a reminder of how far they'd come. As they disappeared into the sunlight, one truth lingered. In a world still learning to see clearly, sometimes it takes one mother's courage to remind everyone what justice really looks like.